Joining me today is Nigel. He's the CEO of Publicis Sapient. Nigel, welcome to PTI Newsroom. It is great to have you.
Thanks you for having me. It's great to be here.
Nigel, let's start off with the digital business transformation. Now, when I look at that term, it is precisely what every company wants today, injecting themselves with a digital DNA. Demystify this for us. What does it really mean?
It means very simply, not simply trying to take something that is analog and making it digital, but it means reimagining a business in the context of a world that is digital. I'll give you a simple analogy, right? Back in the day when the internet first came on board, and that was the birth of the digital movement. I remember, we used to we built some of the first online banks, and we were talking to some of the CEOs then, and it was really hard for people to conceive that the website that the bank was going to launch wasn't about essentially having the bank's information and management team and who they were, but actually have people's bank balances displayed, because they were like, it's confidential, it's sensitive information for people, how will we put this out there? Because they hadn't understood the implications around security, around effectively really thinking about how you would go about doing it. So in that instance today, we don't think about it, right? But banking was reimagined in the context of the internet by every one of us today buying equities on our phones, looking at bank balances, doing complex transformations of our financial portfolios all online without speaking to a single human being. That's the essence of digital business transformation, the real reimagination. And the moment that we find ourselves in today with AI is another big shift in that moment, where we're going from a world where digital was essentially a tool that was enabled by the intelligence of people, to where now you have true machine intelligence coming to the fore. So imagine asking your bank for advice, not a person in the bank, but an actual tool in the bank for advice on how you should save to send your kids to college. And actually them being able to position all their products like high interest savings accounts or government schemes that will help you defer taxes in the context of that question. Like, that's what reimagination of business to me is, and what digital business transformation is.
Come to think of it, I hardly hear the term IT transformation anymore. It is mostly digital transformation. Since when did it become, move from a good to have to a do or die situation for companies?
I think it's really important, the question that you're asking, because digital transformation was essentially another label for IT. It essentially meant you need to upgrade your IT systems, you need to improve things. But digital business transformation is essentially saying, how would you run this business in a world that is entirely digital, right? And that's the shift. And that shift has essentially meant for businesses, as consumer behavior, as citizen expectation of governments, as patient expectations of hospitals have changed, that is the only way to do it. Like you being in the news business, you might actually get your interviews as much followed on a YouTube channel that PTI has as the actual broadcast, right? And that's incredible, because it shifts the narrative for how important it's become. Because yesterday it was important. Today, it's as important as the other channel. And tomorrow, depending on how our behavior as people change, it might be more important.
Nigel, for many, AI today is villain number one, because it is threatening to take away a lot of jobs, conventional jobs as we know it. But you have always been of the belief that technology coming in as a layer onto human capabilities can actually, infuse superhuman capabilities. And a part of that is also rooted in your early childhood years, your struggles with writing. Take us through that experience and how you used technology to overcome all of those challenges. And looking back, do you feel validated today that that philosophy is actually what we see playing out, in a bigger way?
Not so much validated, right? But I'm really excited, because I'm definitely an optimist. As a child growing up, I used to have, the inability to do fine movements with my fingers, which essentially meant that, fine motor skills were a challenge. So writing was very tricky for me, holding a pen. And, you come from India, a country that's so incredible in the context of its focus on knowledge, right? And as a young kid in countries like India and in the rest of the world, you basically have a real challenge when you can't express yourself in writing, because that becomes a judgment on your intelligence and your capability. So you're considered not very bright, you're considered somebody who can't actually contribute. And for me, the discovery of a computer suddenly changed that dynamic completely. So from being unable to write to being able to type fluently meant that you could express your ideas, get your thoughts out, and all of a sudden people were like, hey, this kid might have potential. And at the time, I also happened to be a huge fan of comic books. And I used to read a lot of comic books like Iron Man and Batman. And what I realized back then was that these were regular people augmented by technology that essentially became superheroes. And so this idea for me of, ingenuity, human capability matched with incredible technology is a little bit like how I think about AI today, which is you effectively have to invest in your people and develop them, and you also have to build a suit for them. And you put the suit and the person together and you get Iron Man, this incredible superhero, better than just technology by itself and better than just people by themselves, because it's a combination. And to the first part of your question about AI, essentially, and the jobs it will disrupt, right? Technology has always done that. Now AI is doing it at a faster pace, which puts greater onus on us as leaders in companies to basically recognize that we're going to have to make investments in our people to transition into this new world. But the value that it creates is also exponential. When you think about the world of medicine and healthcare and how much it's advancing drug discovery, how much it's advancing patient care. Today an AI app in your palm has as much pattern recognition as the world's leading specialist on brain health, on nutrition, which is just incredible. Or a kid who might otherwise not have been able to afford, like I might not have had the opportunity back when I was a kid, afford a tutor. Now you can be taught math at your own pace in a way that you learn in a safe space. And that's accessible to everybody. So there are going to be disruptions, but there's also, I feel, going to be huge opportunities, which I'm extraordinarily excited about.
Which are the areas that are going to be first up in embracing this change? And indeed, it is a very disruptive change. It requires a complete change of mindset at the leadership. Are you seeing an alignment of how CEOs are thinking on this? Is that matched to what the market demands? Is it matched to what the entry level workforce coming in? And what could you give some examples in terms of how Publicis Sapient is helping clients, without taking names, in specific sectors, and how AI is really turning out to be a game changer?
Well, if you think about every CEO I talk to today is very, very focused on how their business will need to evolve and be reimagined in the context of AI. I have not seen this much excitement in CEOs and this much recognition, more than excitement, that this is going to be a very significant moment for them as leaders, right? And what that means is real thought about how their business is going to evolve. To give you some examples, in the context of wealth management, we're working with institutions to essentially help people get really personalized wealth advice. Now, not only from the people that they were getting this advice from, but from AI platforms that we've enabled to work alongside these people, which understand your history, which understand your risk profile, which understand all of the potential choices that are available to you given where you live and the regulatory environment in your country, and able to provide you really specific guidance. But the real value beyond that is now, in this instance, that financial institution has an asset that understands my choices as a customer, and that will persist even if the person that is managing the relationship with me chooses to move on from that financial institution. So the bank, in this instance, has now got an asset of intelligence that I will value in my relationship with that bank over restarting that with somebody else, right? In the context of the retail space, when you think about retail as an example, it's really powerful to imagine that we will essentially have agents acting on our behalf to buy the things that we're not necessarily as invested in. So I might basically say, you know what, I want to spend a lot of time on fashion because like I care about how I look. So I might spend my own time looking at clothes, but AI will help me in basically saying, but you already have 6 blue suits and 17 blue shirts because I'm a consultant and I wear a lot of blue and gray. So, here are the things that you need in your wardrobe beyond the things you own, as opposed to buying yet another one of the same things that I might. That's one way in a high engagement category. In a lower engagement category, I might say, you know what, I have no interest in buying, or spending my time in buying toilet paper and dishwashing liquid. There, I want to simply say, I care about something that's this price, that can get delivered regularly at this time when the toilet paper or the dishwashing liquid gets used, and I want to make sure that it's sustainable. And if I have a brand preference, but most often I won't, and the agent will go out and simply buy this on my behalf. And we're building these tools today because you can imagine the buying behavior for these companies in the future will be to sell to you and me as people, but also to sell to your agent and my agent, who will buy very differently than we might buy. Now, you think about, industries like travel. Back in the day, we were one of the companies that created the ability for airlines to basically allow you to pick your own seat, which today is still one of the largest, if not the second largest revenue generator in almost every airline, which used to be a thing that they used to have to pay people at the airports or pay people in the call center to pick on your behalf because, you would need a seat. But effectively, by giving you the convenience and the choice, allowing you to pick your own seat, they've effectively now garnered a revenue stream, which is pure profit for the airline. And to you as a consumer, it's giving you convenience and choice, so you can sit wherever you want and you pay for that.
And you help them initiate that.
We helped them initiate that back in the day.
Which airlines was this?
Because it was a long time ago, the airline CEOs funded this effectively through saying we're going to have faster check-in times at the airport, and we're going to have faster call times. First time, average call handling time and the calls will go down. So it was funded through a cost-saving approach, which is what you're seeing a lot today with AI. AI is funding a lot of cost takeout of the business, but actually there's a huge opportunity for growth, because in that wealth management example that I gave you, you might actually find somebody who's really willing to get a better proposal out because the machine's doing work on your behalf that's more than the person might have done, right? In the context of healthcare as an example, right? If you've got my medical history, if you understand all of my symptoms and you maintain that, as opposed to the 5 minutes you get with a specialist where you have to divulge all of this information and make sure you didn't forget anything, right? It's going to make a huge difference to medical recommendations, because you could already go into the doctor with a hypothesis saying, look, I've evaluated myself against your hospital's AI, and it is telling me to come and see you because it thinks these are the likely causes. Do you concur? Right? Because now you effectively have that same institutionalized knowledge that exists in the doctors in the hospital in an actual AI model that you can consult as a person. And I think these are just some of the examples on the value side. If I look at the cost side, we're basically today leading one of the largest mainframe modernizations. This is effectively taking old IT systems built in the 80s and the 90s into the digital age. And a lot of these mainframes power some of the biggest banks, they power some of the biggest hospitals, core banking systems that are very difficult to change, were built on legacy COBOL technology and many other kinds of legacy technologies. And we're modernizing these to modern digital applications built on services and accelerating them. Some of these projects were going to take companies years to do, in some cases 10, 12 years to do. And we're accelerating those from 10 and 12 years to 2 and 3. So when you think about that kind of acceleration, right, what it's doing is it's essentially allowing IT budgets to go from 80% of your IT budget is basically keeping these old systems and managing them, and 20% is going to innovation. It allows you to invert that. 80% can go into modern digital systems which create benefits for your customers and innovation, and 20% on legacy management. So these are examples on both sides of the spectrum which are hugely valuable. And the shift we're making as a company is going from essentially being a people-only business to effectively a product and people business. So we've built platforms like Sapient, Slingshot, Bodhi. These are our intelligence gathered over 30 years of doing some of the largest transformations in the world, which allow us to accelerate, these journeys that our clients are facing.
But how much of what you're talking about, could get blocked by the trade and tariff headwinds, trade and tariff wars? What's happening on ground? What's the effect of those conversations? What are your clients telling you? Is it delaying the decision making?
Look, I'll start with the latter part of your question and then go to the former, right? I definitely think business absolutely likes certainty. So to the extent that there is uncertainty in, what tariff you might be subjected to, or what tariff you might be subjected to if you ship to a particular country, or in some cases if you're procuring parts from a particular country, which today global trade is so intertwined, right? That creates a lot of uncertainty, and that uncertainty absolutely has an effect of making people more cautious about their investments, and you get this kind of wait and see attitude, which then percolates, right? That said, I think there's definite recognition from companies on the first part of your question that regulatory environments can be accelerants or they can be decelerants, right? And regulation is essentially all about protecting us as people in the context of our data privacy, in the context of bias, in the context of IP, and those things are essential guardrails. But if those guardrails essentially start to become walls instead of guardrails, right? You now start to create huge burdens on companies. And what I think you will start to see is a regulatory environment where some countries will accelerate significantly more than others because of the regulatory freedoms that they have to start to experiment and learn, and others will be held back. So there is a clear distinction in how that plays out in the context of innovation, in the context of what kinds of companies you're starting to see emerge, right? And it's not, it's not necessarily something that is an accidental fact. Like the regulatory context does create momentum in many cases to enable things. From our perspective, one of the things that we're very focused on is making sure that data privacy, data governance, because AI is only as good as your data, right? So is your data in the right shape? Is it essentially connected across the enterprise? Is it accessible to an AI platform that is at the center of your strategy? Or are you doing lots of proofs of concepts across the board and none of those proofs of concepts can scale because they're like things that you can show somebody and they look really cool, but they don't really drive benefit? To give you an example, of the kinds of problems we're solving, right? In the pharmaceutical industry, when you deploy a vaccine or you deploy a drug, right? There's huge amounts of medical and legal guidelines that you have to actually follow because obviously you're talking about people's health, you're talking about lives, you're talking about regulations in countries that come with huge penalties if you don't follow them. And so what typically happened is if you were launching a vaccine, for example, or a drug, you would essentially have to get lawyers who understand the regulations in each of these countries and marketing teams working to basically assess every piece of content that you are producing in the context of this market that you're deploying in. And when you imagine when you're doing this across hundreds of countries in as many languages, that's a long process. So what does that result in? It results in a lot of investment and time and money, but more importantly, it delays the launch of things, right? And we built models on our Bodhi platform that essentially ingest all of the regulations from all of these different countries that basically say something like, New Zealand might not allow you to smile in an ad. And that's something that you have to be aware of. And then the model can evaluate your content against these regulations and go so far as to like highlight the person smiling, and then with a click of a button will regenerate the same image without the person smiling, essentially taking a process that might take a very long time and compressing it. And the value is not just in the cost that you save, but the time to market advantage that it creates for you, right? And that's significant. Another example of the same thing I mentioned, you started off by asking me about digital business transformation. And all of these transformations of IT systems are complex because we've built IT over the last 50 or 60 years. And a lot of them were not built for this digital age. They were not built for me pulling out a device on my phone and suddenly expecting to change a flight or to make a trade or they were just not built for that. So what's happened is we've built lots of layers effectively on top of these old systems, and effectively creates this, imagine spaghetti, like spaghetti code. It's all interconnected and intertwined, and you have to effectively smooth all of this out and then build on it. That takes a lot of money and a lot of time for so many companies, delaying speed to market. So you're a bank CEO and you say, I want to launch this new product. Somebody from your technology team comes back and says, yes, we'll put that in the backlog to do, but it's going to take like 6 or 8 months because the mainframe needs to be changed. And once we change that, the other systems in front of it need to be changed. And that's just too long, which is why that bank can't compete with a fintech, which is,
much more nimble.
Yeah, much more nimble, 5 people able to innovate really quickly, right? What we're doing with these platforms like Sapient, Slingshot, and Bodhi are essentially advancing the ability to move these large organizations at the same speed as a fintech might, or at least significantly faster than they're able to operate today. And that's by doing 2 things. One, allowing them to harness the power of their own intelligence in a way that's incredibly capable. But then second, enabling them to use some of these modern platforms which retain the intelligence that otherwise used to sit only in people's heads over a period of time. And this is, I know we're talking earlier about a fan of Iron Man, right? But this is essentially the Jarvis to the kind of Iron Man idea. Those 2 things means you now are creating institutional intelligence that's constantly learning, which is able to better serve your customers, allows you to better move to identify where the opportunities might exist by starting with your own data. Because there's so much of AI conversations today, so much of them, like just in the news, right? They're basically about effectively the chips. And we need compute. We absolutely need compute. It's hugely important. Then there's a lot of conversations about the models. Again, we need models. But if I was to use an analogy, right? This is very similar to like what happened in the early days of the internet, where Cisco in 1999 was the most, if not one of the most valuable companies there was. Why? Because it was about the pipes and it was about getting the data connectivity, right? And then there were lots of conversations about Netscape and Internet Explorer. Why? Because the browsers were really important. And these things are like basically the conversations today about the compute and the chips and then the models, right?
Look at NVIDIA's
Yes,
valuation.
absolutely. The world's most valuable company, just like Cisco was back in the day. And I'm not saying NVIDIA and Cisco are comparable, but that's the stage we're in, right? But back then, in the days of the internet, Airbnb, Uber, Meta had not been invented yet, right? And imagine how much value was created. You only have to look at those companies today to see how much value that was created then, right? And in the AI age, I feel we're at that point where we were in the kind of like early 2000s and the late 90s, where we're just beginning the journey. The real value of the future of AI is, people today say, well, if you're not NVIDIA or if you're not OpenAI, you're just building on top of them. You're just building a wrapper. You're just a wrapper on them. And there's some truth to that, right? But Uber was a wrapper for taxis. Airbnb was a wrapper for hotels. And these so-called wrappers have become multi-billion-dollar businesses because they added value above and beyond just having a taxi. They added the convenience of being able to get one to you when you wanted it. They added the convenience of being able to find yourself being able to book the kind of car that you want. All of these things are a massive convenience. And of course, now a lot of those companies are going to move into the autonomous vehicle space where the cars will drive themselves to you, right? And that's, I think, that's the same projection you can start to make in the context of AI to see the kind of work we're doing for a lot of clients in terms of the value it creates.
Well, what's the addressable market for this kind of thing? I mean, really, the sky is the limit, right?
It really is, because when you think about NVIDIA's valuation, the reason NVIDIA is so highly valued, right? People recognize that if you're a bank, you're in the technology business. If you're a retailer, you're in the technology business. If you're a hospital, you're in the technology business. You get the idea. I mean, no matter what, you're in the news business, you're in the technology business. Because every one of these companies are existing in a world that is entirely digital, which essentially means that these companies are going to power the future of every single aspect of what we do.
What would newsrooms of tomorrow look like?
When I think about newsrooms of tomorrow, so many people today are consuming news at a level of a tweet. And there's so much content being produced that's incredible, but it's not necessarily getting to the right people in the context of when they need it. So when you're a high school student and you're researching a particular subject, how do you harness the news in the context of that? So to me, just like we were talking about that Netflix example, right? I think news has a role to play to make sure that that opinion and commentary gets to the right people on the right channel in the right context as they want to consume it. Not just in the format that it was created in, because you can disseminate a large part of the conversation we're having into really small chunks that might be relevant for different people who are interested in a very specific context of this conversation, and make the audience that much bigger. And when you start to get the data back on who consumed what content in which piece, you now can start producing more content to address those audiences. So you effectively start to, I think, create this interesting match between finding new audiences for what it is that you do as a news person, but also recognizing what your existing audiences are lacking. What are the subjects that they're interested in? And for me, just like medicine and retail and financial services and the automotive space, news, I think, is an extraordinarily big transformation waiting to happen, because I feel like we're in the midst of it already. You're starting to see now how Google search is changing to AI summaries. Absolutely. And the number of people actually clicking on links has gone down dramatically, because essentially, when I can just get an answer to the question I was asking, why am I clicking on lots of links to do my own research to get that answer? But then, to the questions that you were asking earlier, comes the responsibility of trust, of integrity, of bias, of making sure that IP is protected and things are sourced correctly. Because ultimately, for me, one of the biggest advantages of somebody opining on a social media platform about a particular subject, particularly when it's dealing with something complex like vaccine, which we saw in the context of the pandemic related issues, is the authority and the sourcing of that knowledge. And I think that's one of the biggest things that existing newsrooms have. They have those editorial standards, they have those guidelines, they have the journalistic integrity and the ability to source this information, except now they can deliver it in a multitude of ways. So again, I'm an optimist for that business too.
Nigel, when you do the math, you look at the trade wars, you look at the need for AI, the disruption that's coming, the business transformation, digital business transformation that you're in, and you look at all of these, in tandem, what do the 2026 budgets look like for digital?
When I look at 2026, I think you're starting to see budgets that are better and more significant than we've seen in the past as companies start to realign priorities in order of importance. I think what remains to be seen in 2026 is how the macroeconomic environment improves. What we've seen is pretty stubborn inflation in almost every market. even in markets like the United States where it's held flat at 3%, now as interest rates start to come down, it'll be very important to see that inflation doesn't spike up again, because that usually is something that slows investment in particularly capital projects. I think if you are in the business of operating, right, and operating expenses, those might continue. But particularly as you're thinking about transformation, which requires capital investment, right, that usually is definitely something that is impacted with the uncertainty, particularly around things like inflation, which have persisted and really slowed investment in business for sure.
Before I come to Publicis Sapient's own business in India, there's something I'm very curious about. What does it do to hiring? All of this stuff that we're talking about, agentic AI, Gen AI, a mix of all of that coming into the picture. You talked about AI as a superhero. Most people now in the workforce see it as a sort of a villain. And I'm worried, there was a time when just one college degree was enough to sort of, sustain you for your life at work. It doesn't seem to be the case anymore. I mean, the next generation that is coming into the workforce, what's your advice for them? How many college degrees do they have to go for? Are they even going to be relevant tomorrow?
I think that's a fascinating space to kind of explore. I have a young son, and as I'm in conversation with him and I talk to young people in our own organization, right, I think organizations for the longest time have valued this idea of what you know. Right? You got promoted, you moved through the organization because of what you know. And I think one of the biggest capabilities we'll need to establish going forward is what you actually are able to learn. So I use this mantra and I call it learn, unlearn, and relearn. To use the question that you asked as the frame, right? The way this used to work back in the old days is for the first third of your life, you studied. For the next third of your life, you worked. And depending on how well you did the first two, for the last third of your life, you kind of retired and did whatever it is that you wanted to, right? I think now we're going to see the equivalent of a 4-year college degree effectively, go through multiple times in the context of your organization. You're going to be consistently evolving the time, because you've got a very clear, perspective, I feel, as an individual, to recognize that learning has to be more valued than knowledge, because knowledge is going to become extinct and change almost on an ever-increasing basis. So to me, if you sort of really believe in this idea that you've got to learn, unlearn, and relearn and consistently evolve that, you're probably putting yourself in a good situation. Now, to kind of address the first part of your question, right? There was a study done by an economist called David Autor, basically talking about the fact that in the 60s and 50s, 80% of the jobs that existed then had basically disappeared by the time you got to the early 2000s. So we're definitely going to see, think about it, right? How many times have you gone to a retailer where they've told you, we employ the strongest people in our warehouse because they can lift boxes and shift boxes faster than anybody else, and they can load trucks faster. Why does nobody say that today? Why? Because we've evolved to using forklifts. So it doesn't really matter how strong you are. As long as you can use the forklift, you can lift more weight than the strongest person can. And that idea is true of the white-collar workforce today, too. So effectively saying, I used to do this thing that I learned when I was in college and I've been doing it for 20 years, I think is something that's, a thing of the past. I think what you're going to have to say is, I learned this thing 2 months ago, I'm deploying this thing for the next year, and then the next year after that, I'm going to unlearn that thing that I learned and relearn something new, which puts a certain strain on the organization, but I definitely think it embodies this notion that change is the only constant. So rather than thinking about change in the context of, oh, am I going to have to change? I think we have to prepare young people coming to the workforce to say, you're always going to need to change. And that's essentially what you have to value, this notion that you are constantly unlearning, relearning, and learning. And that's a loop and a cycle. And for the most part of your working life, that's the journey you're going to be on.
Let me take this conversation to your own operations. How do you look at India as a market from a business transformation perspective? What are the companies coming in telling you in terms of what they want the business to be transformed into? And really, India as a workforce, you have close to 10,000 people here. You had talked about a 20,000 roadmap at some point of time in the past. Given this era of AI, do you really think you would have to relook and revisit those numbers? Or is there an addressable market that unlocks because of AI and therefore hiring would be on track?
I think for me, what we're certainly recognizing is the shift to being a people and product company creates huge opportunity in terms of the area we're growing in, right? So in India, we're consistently hiring talent to build products, which was not a space that we've historically been in. Some of the best, brightest engineers, some of the best, brightest designers, strategists. We have this acronym we call SPEED. It stands for strategy, product, experience, engineering, data, and AI. And our belief is speed is like fingers on a hand. If you bring all these ingredients together in the context of a transformation, you really accelerate. And if you have those ingredients but you don't connect them, you don't get the full power. So what we're building is AI-enabled speed teams, as we call them. These are teams that we can deploy to really accelerate the transformation. From a market perspective, we're extraordinarily excited about India. India is a tech-literate workforce with a vibrant community of startups, with an incredibly important part of our team, because we've always operated in India as part of our globally distributed delivery approach. So we've never thought of India in the way, say, a lot of the Indian IT services firms, like with a typical offshoring, outsourcing mentality, right? Our teams in India were very much part of our global teams and today continue to do that. They work seamlessly and we move and distribute work across the world, specifically with leaders from India in leadership positions in many roles. That said, in terms of your broader, market evolution point, right? We definitely think the addressable market is going to be significantly bigger than what we serve today. So for us, it's not just about adding capability or headcount for the sake of adding capability or headcount, right? It's finding the right sets of people who can actually help accelerate what we're trying to build, which is essentially a people and product-led company. And that's a really important distinction.
And what would be your advice to those who worry about their jobs, robotics and AI taking over completely?
I think the reality is you have a very legitimate concern if you're worried about jobs, right? If you're worried about yourself. And for me, I focus on two things for any person. I think the first question you have to ask yourself is, am I doing enough to develop my skills? If I'm a designer, if I'm an engineer, if I'm a product leader, if I'm basically somebody who's a strategist, if I'm a data scientist, am I doing enough to develop my craft and build my skills? And that's part of the responsibility of the organization, but part of the responsibility of the individual, right? And I think that like learning journey of learning, unlearning, relearning becomes incredibly critical there. The second thing that I think is very important is to ask yourself, am I positioned in a way that allows me to create value for the organization that I'm part of? Am I doing something that is meaningfully creating value? And I think what you're starting to see is where people have gotten complacent in roles which are being disrupted by AI, being disrupted by how business is changing themselves, is where you're seeing the most pressure, because they were built for an era pre the one that we're in. What we see is an extraordinary amount of capability and talent in our organization because we were pioneers in this idea of transforming companies from a business perspective to really be digital. So for us, the journey in terms of accelerating our capability and our workforce continues because we are optimistic about the market.
Nigel, as global CEO, and I want to close down with this question. As a global CEO, what are the tech trends that you're most excited about? Actually, might be a redundant question, after our conversation, but if you could just summarize that for us. And what is your vision on how you want to steer Publicis Sapient from here over the next 5 years?
So maybe I'll start with the macro, and for me, I think the biggest thing I'm most excited about is the combination of exponential evolution in so many different fields, robotics, synthetic biology, AI in the context of enterprise transformation, AI in the context of individual personal transformation, right? All of these things coming together, computing power, quantum computing, so the ability to essentially be able to compute just imperceptible amounts of information in the context of what we're doing is absolutely incredible. Setting that context, Publicis Sapient to me is incredibly well positioned to be a leader and is a leader in the context of the transformation space, particularly the transformation of business, what we call DBT or digital business transformation. The acceleration from here comes because I think every single business is going to be forced to reimagine itself in the context of this new world. And what we're doing is we're building incredible products like Sapient Slingshot or Bodhi, which is our agentic platform. Sapient Slingshots are our code acceleration platform across the software development lifecycle. Core AI, which is our marketing acceleration platform. These platforms essentially create an extraordinarily strong intelligence layer in our clients. It's deployed in their environments, in their context, alongside an incredible group of people whose expertise is essential to how these platforms are leveraged to transform. So to me, we go from where we were as a leader in the digital business transformation space to effectively being an AI SI, like a systems integration company that's leading with people and product.
Is there a number there in terms of your investment for India, your hiring plans for India?
We don't necessarily think about this in the context of numbers. For us, it's in the context of the capability and the quality of what it is that we're doing. Because we were never a company that published numbers because we weren't in the scale business. For us, it really didn't matter how many thousands of people you added. What mattered was the kind of impact those people were having. And so for me, what I'd much rather say in the context of India is how many leaders are we creating of global roles? How many clients are we transforming, leveraging teams in India? And that's growing exponentially.
So a lot of Iron Man, but no Thanos. Nigel Vaz, it was wonderful speaking to you. Many thanks for speaking to PTI, sir.
That's great. Thank you for having me.